So hi, everyone. My name is Dan Marlin. I am the Director of Research and Analytics here at Gallon Education in Madison. I have also been a test prep tutor. Mostly doing ACT with some SAT and PSAT for over a decade. And this is a pretty substantial change to the test prep world coming up here with changes to the ACT that are arriving as soon as this spring. So here is the sort of agenda for the evening that we'll be talking about. The when is probably what most of you are interested in, but as I was putting this together, I realized that we kind of have to talk about a lot of other stuff first to give you context as to the when part. So we will get there, but we're going to start with sort of why is it changing, and then the different aspects of the changes, the structure of the test, scoring, the content. Then we'll get to when is all of this happening and when do you need to be worried about it. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we're thinking about preparing our students for the changes that are coming. All right, so let's start with some terminology here. The current version of the ACT was referring to that as the classic ACT. The new version, the version that the ACT is changing to, they're referring to as core ACT. So I'll be using that terminology throughout this webinar. Again, just to sort of give us, it's saying current and new, and it's a little bit confusing. So classic is the ACT as it currently exists, as it has existed for a long time. Core is the new version of the ACT that's coming. Okay, so first bullet point here. Why is the ACT changing? Why did they decide after several decades of keeping it the same that they want to make a change now? Very simply, it's because the SAT changed. So in 2024, the SAT radically changed its test. They made it a lot shorter. They shortened it from about 3 hours all the way down to 2 hours and 14 minutes. There are no longer any long reading passages on the SAT. They're all sort of short chunks, snippets, couple of paragraphs, if that. They made a transition to a fully digital exam. No more paper pencil. You can't take the SAT on paper anymore. They made it adaptive. If you're familiar with grad school exams like the GRE or exams that your students might have taken in school, like STAR or MAP testing, they made it adaptive. So by section, so very simply, a student does really well in the first section, then it sort of has a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. They get kicked up into a harder second module. If they don't do as well, they get into an easier second module. And the upshot of all of this is that the College Board saw an increase in uptake relative to ACT. So this is the ACT's response to what the SAT did. The two tests are sort of always doing this. If you look at a chart of like which tests or a graph of which tests are the most common over time, they sort of cross each other. So for a long time, the ACT was more dominant, and now the SAT is more dominant again. There's a lot of competition for things like state contracts. Here in Wisconsin, of course, the ACT has the state contract, so all students in public schools in the state are taking the ACT next week. And so they're trying to sort of in that competition, not just for students, but also for states to give the SAT or ACT statewide, which is a big source of revenue for them. Here's what that looks like and has looked like since the SAT changed. So the SAT just has an English reading and a math section. If you combine those two sections on the ACT, I mean, you can see how much longer how many more questions students have to deal with, right? 115 questions versus just 54 on the SAT, 80 minutes on those two sections versus just 64 on the SAT. And similar with math, 60 questions and 60 minutes on the ACT. On the SAT, 44 questions, 70 minutes, so a lot more time for fewer questions. And then, of course, no science section. So this shakes out to, again, the state of the world right now, and as it's been for the last few years, or year plus, the ACT has way more questions and takes longer, and the SAT has way fewer questions and goes faster. And so you can imagine why that would be, what a test like the SAT might be appealing to high school students. Okay, so that's the sort of why behind this, a little bit of background there. How is the structure of the ACT changing? This is the big this is where the actual meat of the change is. This is what we are learning about. This is what we're going to prepare our students for. The biggest change for the core ACT, the new version of the ACT, is that the science section is going to be optional. The ACT is not going to require, if the student sits down to take the ACT, that they have to sit through a science section. It's just going to be English, math, and reading that they have to take. We'll talk later about what that actually means in sort of practically, but the ACT says you don't have to take the science anymore if you don't want to. There is going to be both an online version and a paper pencil version. The SAT decided that they were getting rid of their paper pencil version. The ACT does not want to go in that direction, at least not yet. So they are going to offer the same test both on a computer and by paper pencil, and students will have the option of which one they want to take. Again, the extent to which that's actually a choice, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because the availability of that online testing possibility might be limited depending on where you live. It will be shorter, just like the SAT. So if you, even with the science section, the core ACT is going to have 44 fewer questions than the current version. If you lop off the science altogether, it's going to have 84 fewer questions. Students are going to have more time per question, just like they do in the SAT. The new test without science is about 50 minutes shorter than the current version. I should say, well, using my proper terminology, I should say the core version is about 50 minutes shorter than the classic version. They're also going to include what they call field test questions within the actual exam. Historically, what the ACT has done and what they're doing up to this point is there's a short experimental section that students take after they complete the sort of the main body of the ACT. And that's how the ACT tests out questions for future exams. That's always a little bit tricky because if a student knows that a section doesn't count, like to what extent are they even trying on it? The SAT has done this on their exam. They embedded a couple of questions that are unscored that are just basically trial runs for future tests. The ACT is going to do the same thing. So not every question on the core ACT is going to count in the same way that it always has on the classic, the current version of the ACT. We'll talk about what that means and the implications for that too. All of that is to say, this is what that looks like sort of graphically. The classic ACT, again, 215 questions over almost 3 hours. The core ACT shrinks the English section down by 1/3, shrinks the math section down by 1/4. Reading, they basically flip. So it used to be 40 questions in 35 minutes. Now it's going to be 36 questions in 40 minutes. And the science, if a student does decide to take it, will still be 40 questions, but they'll get 5 extra minutes to complete it. So, one of the aspects of the ACT that we are constantly coaching our students on is how to do as well as you can within the time constraints of the test, right? The ACT is a time test. It's what it wants to be. It's what it's always wanted to be. They're loosening that a little bit. You can still see that, not a huge difference, especially on the reading section, but they are loosening that time constraint a little bit. And on math as well. And then they're just cutting down the number of questions that students have to see. And again, if students don't take science, right, 84 fewer questions, 50 fewer minutes, probably going to be appealing for a lot of people. Okay, so that's the big change to the structure, and that's what we're going to be sort of practicing a lot with our students and saying, this is what it used to be, this is what's going to be now, it's going to be a different test. How does this affect the score? Right, this is another practical concern. Right, we're making all of these changes. We're tinkering to this test that's been the same for a long time. How is that going to affect the way that colleges look at these scores, that the scores are reported, et cetera? Still 1 to 36, just like it's always been. The max score in each section is going to be a 36. However, previously, English, math, reading, and science, you add all those scores together, you average them, so divide by 4, and you get your composite score. On the core ACT, the new version of the ACT, science is not going to be included in that composite score. It's going to get its own section score. It's still going to be at a 36. But the only 3 sections that are going to factor into the composite score are now going to be English, math, reading. Again, this is closer to what the SAT does, where they include English, reading, math, but no science questions. Or no science section, rather, in the composite score. What does this mean in terms of looking at the test historically? The ACT has said that it's the same, what they call concordance. This is sort of a term of art in the industry, which is that they're saying that the scoring on the core test is going to be equivalent to scores on the classic test. It's going to be equivalent to the same sort of matching that we did before with the SAT. We'll see. This is one of those things that's a little bit uncertain to see how those scores actually come back. But right now, before we've actually sort of seen any scaling, that's what they're saying. A concern that arises here is with a lot of questions, you get a better sense of how a student's actually performing. When you have fewer questions, the scales start looking a little bit different, right? You miss a question, you lose 2 points instead of 1 point. How well are fewer questions actually going to measure a student's ability or be similar to what it would have been on the previous version of the test? We really do need to see what a scale looks like. So it's a little bit harder to tell right now what that's going to be. Also, something that I hadn't really thought about until I heard it mentioned in another talk that I listened to is it's going to be harder to get a 36 now. Before, you could get away with 2 35s. You get like 36, 36, 35, 35, and that would round up. Now you have to get you can only get 135. You can't get a 30s. You can't get 2 35s, and the 36 is not going to work anymore. When you cut out these every 0.25 every 4 sections, when you cut it down to 3, that makes the scoring a little bit interesting. So a little bit in the weeds there. Sort of things that I think about. But that's also going to be interesting to see how that shakes out. Super scoring is another major topic here, and how colleges are going to look at the core ACT and the classic ACT together or separately. Really quickly, super scoring is when you take a student's best score from each section and make a new composite score that's better. And here's an example of what that might look like, right? A student, could go down in math and reading and up in English and science, and their composite super score is going to go up because you take the best of each section that they've taken. So this is a reasonably common practice. This is more of a college counselor question, schools that your kids are interested in, whether or not they super score. Notably, UW-Madison does not super score, but a lot of schools do. So the question has come up, how are schools going to treat these 2 different versions of the test if students take both of them? It's really going to kind of be a case-by-case basis. The ACT score report, as soon as a student takes a core ACT, and again, we're going to get to the timing of all of this in a minute. As soon as a student takes their first core ACT instead of a classic ACT, their super scores on the ACT's score reporting on the ACT, when they log into their ACT account, they're going to see their core ACT super score, not the classic. Now, again, what are colleges going to do? Are they going to take all their students' ACTs that they submit and super score on their own? Are they only going to super score classic ACTs with classics and cores with cores? Are they going to include science? All of these things are unknown right now as we wait to see the way the colleges are actually going to treat the change in the test. That's sort of a case by case. Stay tuned, talk to your college counselor, go on college websites, see what they're saying about how they're going to handle super scoring between 2 tests that are going to be a little bit different from each other. I mentioned before the field test items, which are also going to make our lives interesting as tutors. On the classic ACT, again, these are items that would have been included in an experimental section for trial for future exams. Every problem within the English, math, reading, and science sections counts, right? You can literally add up the number of questions you get right, match that up to the scale, and you're going to know exactly what score you have. On the core ACT, these field test items are going to be included within each section, and there's kind of a lot of them, depending on the section. So that's going to shrink down. I mentioned the validity issue before, where you have fewer questions to make up a scale. Now we're shrinking that down even more because you're going to have questions that students might think are going to be included that aren't. So even fewer questions are going to count. This also means that 2 students can get the same number of questions right on a section and get a different score, which is not something that's been the case before on the ACT. It's been the case on the SAT, but not on the ACT. So that's another new thing that we're going to have to navigate as tutors on the test prep side in terms of trying to coach students of how to maximize their time and which questions to attempt and things like that. Okay, so we talked about structure, we've talked about scoring. How is the content of the ACT changing? Good news here is that it's not changing much. We have one exam that the ACT has released of one core, I should say, ACT that they've released. And so far, it looks pretty much the same as the exams we've had before in terms of content. Obviously, the structure is a little different. English is going from 5 long passages to 6, and sort of 4 longer passages and 2 shorter ones. One probably nice thing for students is on the English sections that have existed on the classic ACT, sometimes there's just an underlined portion and the student has to correct it without sort of any direction of how to do that. On the core ACT, every question is going to have an instruction with it, like how to, even if it's something as simple as how do you make this sentence grammatically correct. Math is going down from 5 possible answer choices to 4. Again, this is what the SAT does too. So no more E and K answer choices. But again, because they're trimming down the number of questions, it's not that the content is necessarily going to be different, but I'm sort of anticipating that the types of questions students are going to see might shade more toward the more challenging side. In other words, some of the easier questions that would have been on a classic test might be eliminated, but a lot of the harder questions might stay. And that's just, again, because you have fewer number of questions, you need to have a good scale of difficulty to make sure that you're getting the right sort of bell curve on the scaling. Gets into the weeds again a little bit there, but I wouldn't be surprised if the number of hard questions, the percentage of hard questions is greater than the percentage of questions, basically. Reading is cutting down from 10 questions per passage to 9, but those are still going to be longish reading passages, unlike on the SAT where they've really shortened them down to more like paragraphs. And then for students that are going to take the optional science section, they've added a passage back, so there's going to be 7 passages instead of 6, which just means there's going to be fewer problems per passage because there's still going to be the same number, 40 total, in the section. So that is the changes to the content. And again, in sort of a more graphical form, this is what that looks like. So the classic version of the English section, 5 long passages, each with 15 questions. The core version, 4 long passages with 10 problems, 2 short passages with 5 problems. Math, again, changing from 5 possible answer choices to 4. Reading changes from 10 questions per passage to 9. And then science adding a passage so that there's fewer questions per passage. And finally, when will all of this, everything that I've just talked about, when is this taking place? This is probably the most confusing part of this webinar. So I will do my best to go slowly and explain it in as much depth as I can without confusing everybody. Okay, so the first online core assessment, the first new version of the ACT that will be rolled out is coming in April. That will only be online in April, June, and July. The paper pencil version will still be the current version of the ACT through then. Starting in September, the paper pencil version will then also change to the core format. So then at that time, that's when students will really have a choice of, okay, I'm taking the same test, I'm taking the core, and I can just decide if I want to do paper pencil or online. School day testing, so again, what's happening next week here in Wisconsin, where all students in public schools take the test in school as part of the school day. That is not changing to core until next March 2026. So what that means, there are schools that give an in-school test in the fall, usually in October. Even though the national tests will all have shifted by then to core, any tests given in school in, say, October is going to still be the classic version of the ACT. So even as we're preparing rising juniors, current sophomores for the core version of the ACT, if we have any students that we know we're going to take an in-school test in the fall, they will also prepare for classic. So this is, again, quite confusing. But here's basically who's going to be affected and when. Current sophomores, rising juniors, class of 2027, they're going to be affected by this. They're going to, and unless they're taking the test of sophomores this spring, they're going to be taking the core ACT. Current juniors, so the class of 2026, rising seniors, may be affected under 2 circumstances. One, if they choose to take the national ACT online between now and July, Or if they take the test and follow their senior year for whatever reason. We usually like to have juniors wrapped up by then, but sometimes they continue into their senior year. If they take a test and follow their senior year, they will be taking the core ACT, again, unless they take an in-school test in the fall. This is very confusing. And this is a visual of that probably makes it more confusing, but this is a roundup of what I just talked about. Current juniors, rising seniors just have a ton of options right now, but it's confusing the way that this is going to look. Right now, everything's classic through March in school. In April, we have this parallel track going where we have paper pencil classic version, online core version, whether that's with science or not. Same with June and July. September, paper pencil shifts over to core as well. But there's this weird interruption in October for any schools that are giving the test in school where it's going to be classic again. And then back to paper pencil for the rest of the national tests next school year. I didn't even mention, by the way, that there is a writing section still. Those of you that have students that are going to take the test next week are probably aware of this. It used to be a section that most colleges wanted to see. And so we used to prep students for it. Now it's sort of just an appendage. The state is required the ACT gives it as a state writing test because the state is required to give a writing test to juniors. No schools really care about it. But technically students could, like this is six possibilities that students could run into. You add writing to this and now you add 6 more. Again, very few students are going to need to worry about the writing at all. They'll just take it in school next week because they have to. But this is not even all of the options that students are going to have to navigate. Another important thing to note is that the online option that I keep talking about, the core online, is really going to be subject to availability. We don't, as of right now anyway, there are no sites within like a 60-mile radius of Madison that are offering the core online in April, June, or July. That might change, but last I checked, which was very recently, they're not offering that. So for some students, that core online test might not even really be a true option unless they want to drive for a while. We'll have to kind of see how that rolls out. And I have some sort of lingering questions on that that we'll talk about toward the end. But just to be aware, it's not like students are going to be able to walk into school to their ACT site in April that they sign up for paper pencil and say, no, actually give me a computer. I want to do an online test. It's not how it's going to work. They need to make more sites available for that to happen. So we'll see what happens in the fall. But as of right now, paper pencil is, at least in the Madison area, is really the only practical option for the spring. Okay, so how are we thinking about this as a test prep company, like as test prep tutors, as myself as somebody that trains our new tutors and gives presentations like this and talks to families? How are we going to prepare students for the changes that are coming? How are we thinking about it? So again, current juniors, the class of 2026, rising seniors, we're recommending heavily that they take the paper pencil classic ACT, the current version that's existed for a long time, or the SAT. The reason for that is, there are several reasons for that, all that are listed here. I already mentioned the limited number of online ACT testing sites for the spring. We just don't have that many close by. We don't really have any close by, they're pretty far. Anytime a new test rolls out, this has happened as the SAT has sort of morphed and changed over the years. There's uncertainty with scoring and scaling. A lot of times there's not a way for these testing companies to truly truly test their tests that they've created on a whole population of students until they actually roll it out to everybody. And so there's always a little bit of weird scoring in those first few administrations that we want. We don't. Our goal is to make students as comfortable and certain as possible when they come in to take a test. And this is just going to present a bunch of uncertainty and uncomfortableness when they do that. So we're really, because of those things, we really want to see what the scaling actually looks like, what the scoring actually looks like from students that take it, not in sort of an experimental way, before we make any recommendations on that front. There could be glitches with the online platform. That happens too sometimes. The ACT created one called Gateway. That's their online platform. The College Boards, it's called Blue Book for the SAT and PSAT. And so, again, we want students to be as comfortable and certain as possible, and we don't want them dealing with tech glitches when they're trying to focus on a standardized test that they've been preparing for months. And we just don't have a ton of resources yet. We'll get them, and like I said, the content's pretty similar, but we want a big part of what we practice with students is pacing and timing. We want to make sure we have the right sort of material so we can practice that with students, not just the content part. Another thing that we're advising, and if you see, other reports or webinars or whatever on this, we are also still advising that students take the science section. Everybody's sort of advising this right now, because at least in the short term, we think schools are still going to require students to submit science scores, especially the sort of more selective schools. As on the SAT, it's likely possible, if not likely, that science questions will get kind of folded into the reading section or the math section. What the SAT has done with this is basically a couple of their reading passages are, interpreting sort of charts and graphs and tables, just like the ACT science section is. So I wouldn't be surprised if we also see that start showing up on the ACT as well, as they, sort of seem to try to push science out the door a little bit. We're hearing too that on those science problems, the ACT science historically has not really been science. It's more just like how you read charts and graphs and tables. There have been a couple of outside knowledge questions on every science section. We are hearing that there's going to be more of those outside knowledge questions as well on the core ACT. That might make the science a little bit more challenging and more sciencey. But we're still going to prepare students to take it until we see that colleges are not considering it, which could happen. We don't know. Again, much of our prep won't change. The content's basically the same. A lot of the timing and pacing strategies will still work. The timing will just be different. We still are going to identify or try to identify which test a student might prefer, the ACT or the SAT. Even with the shorter ACT format, some students still might want to take the SAT. Our advice is always come in, take a diagnostic ACT, take a diagnostic SAT, see which one goes better, see which one you like better, and then we can go from there. We train our tutors to tutor both. We're also going to tailor our prep. Some students might love the idea of taking a test on a screen. Other students might be sick of looking at screens all the time and want to do paper pencil. We'll tailor our test prep, assuming that there's more and more online sites available over time. We'll tailor our prep to what students want and what we think is best for them. The online platform is going to have a ton of features that students can use. There's a flag for review option, which is always the one that I find really valuable, where students can, if they're not sure about a question, but they need to move on, they can flag it and come back to it later. That's a little bit easier than like flipping through a booklet and looking for which one you circled. There's a timer on the screen. They can show it. They can hide it if it makes them nervous. They can eliminate answer choices just by Xing them out. They can mask the answer choices and just look at them one at a time, where the other ones are sort of covered up. They can highlight text. They can magnify text. There's something called a line reader, which also kind of has that same effect, where it'll kind of just slide down the text and you'll be able to, focus on one part of it. There's a built-in calculator. The Blue Book app that College Board creates uses Desmos, which your students are probably familiar with. It's a super powerful graphing calculator, can do a ton of stuff. At least what I've seen so far at the ACT is their built-in calculator is more just like a standard scientific calculator. So students are probably still going to want to have their own. Students will be able to use their own computers if they download a gateway. There's always some restrictions on the tech you can use, but in general, they probably will be able to use their own devices or a device provided by the host site. But again, that availability of testing sites that offer that online option right now is super limited, at least in our area. So they might not have that option quite yet. And finally, just looking forward and some other considerations, probably most of which I've already mentioned. How will sites handle the likely increased demand for online testing? Unclear. We need more sites in the area to know. Will the ACT continue to offer a paper pencil option? They seem to be committed to that right now, at least as part of this transition. It's possible in the future they'll do away with it like the SAT does, but for now they're going to keep it. Will the science section eventually go the way of the writing section? I've sort of teased this a little bit as we've gone along, but right now, like I said, we're still advising students to take it. In the future, it's very possible that college is going to stop caring about it, just like this. Excuse me, just like they stopped caring about the writing section, and then we won't advise students to take it anymore. But for now, we are working under the assumption that people are still going to want to see the science section. Will the online version ever become adaptive? So again, what the SAT does is adaptive by section. It's not by question, but you get you get a certain number of questions right, or you do well enough on one section, and you get a harder second one, and that gives you the opportunity to get a higher score. You can't do that with a paper pencil exam. So that second bullet point and that last one are sort of related, right? If the ACT does get rid of a paper pencil option, it might be because they decided to also create an adaptive test like the SAT. So that's a whirlwind half hour on upcoming changes to the ACT. I believe there's a chat function that is available if you have any questions about what I just talked about. Actually, also just opened up a Q&A option if that works better. Well, if nobody has any questions, hopefully you're not somehow muted from from asking me them. But if nobody has any questions, if you think of one later, or if I didn't set up the question and answer or chat properly, feel free to shoot us an email at info@galanet.com. That's just our general inbox, and it'll definitely get routed in my direction if it has to do with this webinar. Thank you all for coming. I hope that was informative and helpful. And as we continue to track these changes and sort of the practical, pragmatic effects of what these changes mean over the course of the next several months, we might have more of these. But we're going to have to kind of see how everything goes. Like I said, it's a big change to a test that's been the same for a long time. So again, thanks for taking time out of your evening to join us. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions, and have a great night.